There is a fifth dimension.
About the unknown.
Beyond that which is known to man.
The Garden of Thought.
The Babylon Project was our last best hope for peace.
Unexplained.
Mythologies.
This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call
The Garden of Thought with Jeff Lippman.
Welcome into the Garden of Thought, and returning guest Bernie Taylor is here with another one of his beta tests on us, where he gives us one of his presentations, but usually it's on some mutually agreed upon topic that starts out with something that I want, he turns into something that he's already working on, and it's close enough. So here we are again with our friend Bernie Taylor, who's working on getting himself a bespoke Garden of Thought tailored blazer after being guest so many times. How are you, Bernie?
Jeff, life is wonderful. I recently looked through or listened through your podcast, and I could not find the one that explained how you found such a gorgeous wife. Which episode is it?
It might be the one that was dropped today, where we talked about the what is the devil's name. So that might be a spoiler. Clearly, I made a deal with. Nobody understands it. I don't either. The funniest thing, well, she edits the show, but she doesn't really listen, so I can say the funniest thing is she's jealous of me, which exactly. That's the appropriate reaction. So, like, she's convinced, like, all day long I'm, talking to girls, which is all day long, like, the cats won't even hang out with me. So it's, so anyway, but
so you need to do like a full How to Be a Beautiful Wife episode.
If I actually knew of a method that might work for others, I'm open to it. Maybe that one would slingshot me into the stratosphere, and then we could bring all this wonderful knowledge to the broad base as opposed to sort of like the I don't know, I won't call it the small base, but a modest base.
You mean your buddies at the Baltimore bar?
Like I have any. Come on now. I have like 5 drinks a year. All right. So, well,
a nice program.
Yeah.
Nice program.
Yeah. So,
was Crete Atlantis?
Right.
Which is something. I think we've had 4 or 5 episodes already, and you have brought up the question of Atlantis in every one of them. You have popped the question, one would say. And every time I said, it's another episode for another day, and so we are now going to see if we can answer some of your Atlantis questions. Are you good with that?
I am very good with that, and like in fairness to me, it's like I don't have like a absolute fascination with Atlantis, but like a lot of your presentations have to do with the Near East and the Mediterranean, and Atlantis looms large in that, and also Atlantis is a really good placeholder for a civilization sort of just outside of the realm of history, just on the outer edges of history or prehistory. The mayor and people have fun with thinking about it. Some people take it too seriously. Some people take it seriously and use it, for thinly veiled nefarious means. But yeah, I've had, folks on here about that Atlantis was simply allegory. I've had folks on here say that Atlantis was the Rechat structure, and I believe it's in Mauritania. I've had folks say that Santorini was Atlantis, and the volcano was Atlantis, which doesn't make sense because of the timeline. But anyway, I've not heard Crete, but Crete ties into a lot of things I'm curious about. First of all, they have a pantheon which apparently is different than most of their neighbors on land or around the Mediterranean and in the Near East, and they also may or may not have been part of that group of collective, or they might have been Cretans or Cretians, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, who were part of the Sea Peoples, or who people also like to use as a placeholder for everything holy and unholy and mystical when they say the Phoenicians. So there is my little caveat. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say about Atlantis and Crete. I remember loosely back in middle school when we would start with Western civilization, we usually started I don't know if it was Egypt or not, but we definitely early on was the Minoans, and then we got into Greece.
Exactly. That's interesting timing. Well, I started this program off as with the question was Crete, Atlantis, and you have just answered. You have just posed 20 more questions that I am asked to now answer. And in our discussion today, we're going to break into three parts. The first one, the Minoans, as you've already mentioned, and then Minoan origins of Atlantis.
Okay.
In the words of the great Plato. And Plato left us the lost civilization of Atlantis narrative in two books, his Timaeus and Crete. Well, I don't think either of them we have their complete text, but we have a great deal of text. And Plato was 428 to 348 BCE, long time ago. And one can read this in English. You can download the Timaeus and Crete in English. You can download Kindle. You can buy the book 10th hand on Amazon because these things appear to pass around over the years. But this is, it exists. And if you go to the Vatican museums, I think you said you did, and you go to the so-called Raphael rooms, you will see the School of Athens, a huge fresco on the walls. And in the left arm of Plato is his Timaeus.
Mm.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So Raphael himself thought there was some validity to this narrative. And of course, it is Plato on the School of Athens, but the character, the head and the face and all that sort of stuff is Leonardo da Vinci. So that's how Raphael did things. He would place people from two different time periods in the School of Athens and other frescoes to show these connections.
Meeting of great minds and the privity of them.
But yeah, so one of the most famous paintings in the world, and truly one of the most famous characters on that painting is Plato with his Timaeus underarm.
Sure.
You know that before, yeah.
That he was carrying the Timaeus in there. I no. If I knew it,
you can read it there, right? You can read it. Did you go to the School of Athens? You go to the Vatican museums?
No, definitely. I mean,
okay, you get a pass.
Yeah, I mean, I have visited there through the novels of Dan Brown and others, but no, not myself.
So you get a pass on that one.
Okay, good.
But everybody else out there in podcast land who has been to the Vatican museums and seen the School of Athens, you don't get a pass. It says it right there. And then so the Minoans. Plato wrote about Atlantis. Archaeologists, this isn't me, this isn't Bernie, this isn't Jeff. Archaeologists believe the strongest argument is for Atlanteans to be on Crete. And there was a series on PBS, so we're talking about Nova sort of stuff, the fall of the Minoans in 2011. But many archaeologists since then have actually said that Crete is the best case. So we are now testing the case of archaeology, not the case of the greater Graham Hancock world, right? Is it in fact the case? And so enter the Minoans of Crete on Crete. And enter the Minoans of Crete. And the Minoans of Crete are on an island to the south of Athens. Crete is part of Greece today. Now, neighboring Santorini to the north, roughly between Athens and Crete, is Santorini.
So I failed your test on the Vatican, but I have been to Athens, Santorini, and Crete.
Wow, that's a good one. I envy you. Now, in Santorini, you may have went to the bar with the blue roof, or you might have gone to the Agratory Museum, which is a little far off the beaten path. The Agratory Museum advertises Atlantis as being on Santorini. This is not me. This is the archaeologist at the Agratory Museum. And they say it's tied, connected myths and geology. That's their narrative. And the Agratory has ruins of the Minoans. The Minoans were not just people of Crete, but they're people who have been in the region, including Santorini and at the ruins, Agratory ruins. And on the walls of the Agratory ruins, we find frescoes that are very similar to Minoan style. They're attributed to Minoans. Minoans had boats. They're not big like Columbus sailboats, but they rode around the Mediterranean.
Right. It looks not terribly unlike Egyptian boats, or almost like a multi-person powered gondola.
Absolutely. And so we have to. The story of Crete connects with the story of Santorini, which we'll get to their eruption a little later on. So these are narratives that are tied together. You can't really separate the two because the Minoans were in both places. Okay. Now, according to Homer, the great Homer, the Iliad and Odyssey, there was a tyrant king, Minos, king of Crete, who gave his children to the Minotaur, or the Minotaur. Okay. We find that spoken about in his works.
Well, not all of them.
Well, these two works. I believe they're in both works.
No, I mean he didn't give all his kids to the Minotaur. He had to give some of them because he I think he screwed over either Zeus or Poseidon by doing something bad with not giving him a sacred prized white bull or something, and tried to trick him with a regular bull, and then he got the god's wrath, which led to offspring of half man, half bull, and of course then. The whole thing with Theseus and the Daedalus' the labyrinth and Ariadne's thread, and she was Minos' daughter. Now, maybe she was trying to stave off being fed to the Minotaur. I don't remember the poem or the play or the myth that well. But I thought maybe it was her sister or brother she was trying to save, though maybe her day would have come. Anyway, Theseus killed the Minotaur. That much I remember. Cut his head. And like all Greek heroes, when you look at him a second time, Theseus is actually fairly horrible himself. But Ariadne liked him, or at least saw a savior.
Absolutely. And they're fascinating this in that genre. Now, Minos, or the connection of the Minoans to this Crete, comes from Sir Arthur Evans, 1851 to 1941, and he established the Bronze Age dating of Knossos. So Bronze Age, 1900. He said 1900 BC of Knossos by cross-dating earlier dates of imported Egyptian pottery. Now everybody has seen the image of Knossos. There's three pillars. On a block structure, and the pillars are red. They're bright red, and the pillars have a roof above them. Fairly common image. If you see anything of Knossos, or you see anything of Crete, it will be the temple, so-called Temple of Knossos. Now, so 1900 was the age that Evans gave to Knossos, but the Minoans had been there much earlier. But Minoans go back to at least 3000 BCE, so 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago before Evans dating
of
Knossos. Okay. And so they were much earlier civilization, and they continued on. Now, Evans said that it was the palace of Minos at Knossos. This comes from his words, because that was the title of one of the books he wrote. Okay. So archaeologists made this one up. Okay, this is not the alternative archaeology world. This is solid archaeology. Okay? And by the way, it is Sir Arthur Evans. Therefore, he was widely regarded. Now, Bronze Age archaeologists today they don't like the name Minoans at all. They don't like it because they say, well, it appears to validate Homer's King Minos or the Minotaur. So they just don't like that word. They just said, why don't we call this early Bronze Age? The archaeologists do not.
Well, what would they call it instead of King Minos? I mean, it's Minoan. What would they call it? Cretan? Knosson?
Early Bronze Age. They call it early Bronze Age on Crete. That's what they call it.
I mean, the early Bronze Age was everywhere. I mean, at some point.
So they will say early Bronze Age on Crete. They do not like that term Minoans, but it is a popular word for tourist guides and for the media and so on.
Sure.
Because it puts a really good, there's a story behind the story.
Now that Minotaur on that coin there really looks very Egyptian art, like, as opposed to, we think of the Minotaur as being big and buff on the top and carrying a big battle axe, and this, is rather thin, and even the back of the headdress sort of has that Egyptian, like, that B stripes, though it's red and black instead of gold and black or yellow and black. But to me, it looks more.
You're not the first person to point out there could be an Egyptian connection to Crete and Minoans.
I mean, it is right there between, Egypt and, and then the Mediterranean wasn't always as deep and as hard to traverse as it is now. And it's not that hard to traverse now for, people who can traverse.
And that is what the archaeologists have said.
Okay, good.
That is not a narrative I agree with, but I'm going to explain why later.
Okay.
That is what you make a good archaeologist later on.
I don't think so. I'm not that patient, but and I don't like to get dirty, and I don't like being bit by mosquitoes. But let's go with you. You're absolutely right.
So the palace at Knossos, where everybody remembers seeing those three tall pillars with the flat roof, didn't look like that when Sir Arthur Evans arrived. That is a structure that he built. Okay, and some people like it, some people don't like it. But is it based on the actual archaeology? We don't know. He did his own reconstruction, and for whatever reason or reasons, that people are like, you're just guessing what it looks like. Beautiful structure. Beautiful. Now let's put the Palace of Minos at Knossos, Crete, in the bigger context, because we have to look at this in the bigger context. So Göbekli Tepe was about 11,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Egypt, 5,000 years ago. Sarsen Stonehenge, about 5,000 years ago, and the Palace of Knossos was 4,000 years ago. So the Palace at Minos, doesn't matter how you see the reconstruction, was not early on in the stages of monuments. Okay, long before that was the Great Pyramid at Giza, and many long before that was the Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. That's really an important concept to recognize, is that Knossos was not that long ago. While the so-called Minoans were there earlier, it was not that long ago.
I mean, but in fairness, I think Abraham was 4,000 years ago also. So it's, if you believe that he's historic, that's a pretty long time ago.
It's a long time ago, but Göbekli Tepe, we're talking 11,000 years ago.
Well, that was just A. You didn't even need the Braham.
Exactly. Yeah. So the concept that Knossos, the House of Knossos, of Minos at Knossos, was not that long ago.
Do you like how I like my little jokes, but nobody else likes my little jokes?
I like your jokes.
Right.
I listen. I write them down. I take notes. You don't see.
It's true.
So second chapter in our series is the Minoan origins of Atlantis.
Wait. It was but the Minoans, there's a few things we know. One, I think we know about. They didn't have high walls, so apparently they weren't particularly afraid of being invaded.
Right.
Two, I think that they were one of their, aside from obviously being seafaring and fishermen and all that, and, having bulls and, regular kind of farming and ranching, like you'd think of. Weren't they big in dyes? They had colorful dyes they traded in.
Okay, you're two slides ahead of me. You're two. We're gonna get there.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that was part of the Atlantis story. I thought that was just.
We're gonna talk about
okay. Sorry.
But yes. So anyway, the so-called Egyptian connection, which we kind of looked at, broached a few moments ago. So the Egyptians were, before the Palace of Knossos, the Egyptians were the Great Pyramid of Giza. We're talking 700 years earlier. And Crete, as you're right, is not very far from Alexandria, Egypt. It is, it's about equidistant to Athens. Now, the colors and the dyes, which are both on the clothes and on the frescoes. People have said that it is an Egyptian connection based on the frescoes. The frescoes are, it's wet plaster on the walls that is given a pigment. It's a wet process. And there are many images of frescoes at Knossos or from Knossos that people say, well, that looks just like the images from Upper Egypt. And yeah, they do, but they actually don't. Because once you know a little bit more, they don't. And there's images, a lot of images of these rivers and people walking along the rivers, very similar to what you find in the tomb chapel of Nabobbum, which is the British Museum. Everybody's seen that image. It's a guy, a man walking forwards on a skiff. His wife behind him, his child's below him. He's surrounded by birds. Okay. And the tomb chapel of Nabobbum is also almost identically replicated in the tomb chapel of Akkad and the tomb chapel of Minoan. Very similar scenes, and people say, well, that looks just like the one in Knossos, therefore they are the same. And in Knossos, from Knossos, there are treasures, and one of them is this person looks very similar to the tomb chapel of Nabobbum, where he's walking forwards and he's got birds around him and so forth. And they say that, well, that also is not just tied to the tomb chapel of Nabobbum, but also the astronomical seal in the tomb of Senimus, which is key word there was an astronomical ceiling. But there's also a difference there's also some slight variations. Is that in the tomb of Nenema in Egypt, we'll call them the kilts, the best word, kilts are tilted downwards in a way that nobody could wear a kilt because the kilt would fall down. Oh. Whereas the so-called kilts among the Minoans in Crete, it's pretty much straight across. Now, this is an important concept, okay? This is an astronomical ceiling in the tomb of Nenemus, widely recognized. And I would propose that the tomb chapel in the Nabobbum fresco is also an astronomical image, because the slanting of the waist is representative of the three stars in the belt of Orion. And then the other stars we have form under his arms, and the so-called bow of Orion is a stick that he holds in his hand. In Greek mythology and Greek astronomy, Lepus, what Orion chases, is actually the skiff of the boat. So the two of Nabobbum and these other ones that we see are actually astronomical images, the same what we have with the Sentiment, which does not connect with the Minoan artifacts. It's almost as if they saw the picture, but they didn't understand what was behind the picture. They didn't know that these were astronomical elements. So one could say that they didn't have all of the information. They weren't in the know.
So it is inspired by, but just the artwork itself, not the message behind the artwork.
The message behind it.
Yeah,
so
there's a lot of familiar sort of images in the Minoan one. There's double snakes sort of coiled upwards towards the sky on both sides. There's, I guess it's a heron or a duck or something on both sides. There are what looks to be eagles or angels, I don't know, and a bunch of sun discs, towards the bottom. This would make a pretty ornate, I don't know how big it is in real life, but, you could see it as a very ornate jewelry piece on someone's necklace or whatnot. Also, the headdress is entirely not like anything I've seen in Egypt. In fact, the body, again, my eyes are not that great and sort of small, but if I was just to guess and you just sort of cut it off from the shoulders up and ask me, where do you think that's from, Jeff? I'd probably guess it's from Mesoamerica or South America.
It kind of does look like that. Yes, I would say that it does look like that, but I would not make the case that it is from. But archaeology, you can imagine archaeologists who don't have this archaeoastronomy background would say, well, these look the same. Well, they look the same unless you understand the differences between the two, the symbolic differences. And I think that's so is there an Egyptian connection? I would say that they saw each other's art, but they had no inside knowledge of each other's art.
And they use each other's materials. So simply they figure which dyes or bloods or whatever to make paints, and they basically both have almost like a watercolor kind of style, and that can be an accident, but maybe it's not as well. But yeah, no, and the Minotaur picture from before, first of all, looks nothing like any of these. But if you had told me that's Anubis, I'm not, I probably wouldn't have looked enough at the details to know the difference and to try to correct you out of context.
Yeah. So now they say there's an Egyptian language connection because they both early on they use hieroglyphs. And I'm not a hieroglyph expert, but I've compared a few of these different things between the Minoans and the ancient Egyptians. They just don't look the same to me. As I say, I'm not a hieroglyph expert. I just don't see it. But that's what they say. But what I can see is a massive difference between the length the inscriptions. The next stage, when the Egyptians had hieroglyphs, continue to have hieroglyphs, the Minoans had a linear inscriptions. I can see a massive difference between those, because I'm not going to say the Minoan linear A looks like Chinese, but looks more like Chinese than it does like an Egyptian hieroglyph.
It's less pictograph and more character, like representation characters, like letters.
Exactly, yeah. So I would say this so-called Egyptian language connection as proposed by this whole Egyptian connection proposed doesn't make any sense to me. But what we can see is that between Agratory at Santorini, that their script is identical to that of the Minoan linear A. So the Minoans were on both Crete and Santorini. They were a common culture. We can say that both based on the art as well as the language. So people always say, well, what does the DNA say? And the DNA says an awful lot about the subject. The genetic origins of the Minoans and Mycenaeans show no Egyptian or Phoenician DNA. No Egyptian or Phoenician DNA. No measurable African or Levantine influence.
Okay. So I think right now, I think a lot of people know that Mycenae is Greece. Mycenae is where Agamemnon was from, the guy who sort of rallied the troops to invade Troy. And people called Greeks Mycenaeans before they called them Greeks or Hellenics. I think the Mycenaeans themselves called themselves Achaeans, but in any event, Mycenaean is basically synonymous with like central Greece, I guess, above the Peloponnese. And Phoenician, I'm not sure that anyone exactly knows what Phoenician is. Certainly there's at least one city called Phoenix, but when people talk about Phoenicians, I think they're talking about either by coincidence or by some confederacy of basically pirates, basically Mediterranean Vikings who gathered together and had organized around the same time and took advantage of some decaying civilizations in the region, and sort of were either caused or were a part of the cause or took advantage of the epical Bronze Age collapse. But I don't know that the Phoenicians are any one person. It's sort of like from all around the giant backward sea of the Mediterranean, though I think most of it is considered sort of like the coast of Israel, Lebanon, Anatolia, Syria, and then up into the Bosphorus and Black Sea, sort of that area, and then off to the west to Greece as well, and all those islands. There's tons of islands there, and like all of those islands are populated.
That's good. I like that. So in the paper of the genetic origins of the Minoans and Mycenaeans, the Minoans and Mycenaeans are genetically similar. 3/4 of ancestry comes from Neolithic farmers of Western Anatolia. Western Anatolia would be today's Turkey, and the Aegean, and the remainder from ancient populations from the Caucasus and Iran.
Okay.
These people don't come from Egypt, but that's what the archaeologist argument has been, and is clearly still some of these places. And so the paper also said that the Mycenaeans, we'll call these the ancient Greeks, they derived additional DNA from hunter-gatherers of Eastern Europe and Siberia. So they came from the north. They didn't come from Egypt, the Egyptians.
Scythians.
You could say, yeah, Scythians would be a good name.
Hurrians, yeah.
So in a regional timeline, the Mycenaeans come on the scene 750 BCE. The Minoan Palace of Knossos, as we said, was started at 1900 BCE, and the Minoans were in Crete 3100 BCE. So the Minoans were in Crete and in the region, at least for Crete and Santorini, much earlier than the Mycenaeans. People had been around for a long time, but they came south in this region about 750 BCE.
What about their gods? I mean, Greek had Zeus and the Olympians. In Egypt, you had Ra and Horus and Osiris and Isis and all those. And then the Near East, you had Yahweh and Baal and Marduk and Ishtar and company. In all those areas. But a lot of them sort of seem to be different names for the same or similar traits. Did the Minoans have their own
Mycenaeans? The Mycenaeans.
Well, I'm assuming the Mycenaeans had the Zeus, Apollo, Athena hero group. I know there's a city called Heraklion for Heracles who's on Crete because I was there. But I'm wondering, did the Minoans have a different panoply or pantheon, or did they subscribe? Because sometimes you can tell the culture by who their gods were, and sometimes what happened when their gods changed, if they changed.
You were asking a question that nobody knows, and the answer that nobody knows it is because we can't read their script.
Oh, well, maybe AI will figure that out. But of course, since nobody can read their script, we won't know if the AI got it right.
Exactly. So since we can't read their script, we don't really know what those things were. But as we go through, and that's what happened, the people have said, well, Crete is Atlantis because we can't explain anything else about them as a lost civilization. I'm going to debunk that whole story either as well. But because there is this void of a script that we can't read, we can't tell the narrative, therefore people have inserted Atlantis into that. And
so there's no monuments or statues or temples that are clearly to, a warrior goddess or, the figurines all throughout the, Middle East and into Turkey are sort of the full-bodied sort of matron woman.
So there are figurines, and we also had that character that was walking across on the skiff that people said, well, that's the same as the Egyptians. So what's happened is people have taken their own baggage into the argument to say, well, they're Egyptians, but now we know they're not Egyptian because there's no overlap in the DNA.
Yeah.
So people have, projected their ideas onto the Minoans, whether that be Sir Arthur Evans with the Minotaur and King Minos. People are projecting, but they don't really know. And what we're going to go through today what we are going through today is showing that these concepts that people have projected have no foundation to them at all.
Okay, so it might have been the culture itself might have been an isolate. It might have been, not that it was isolated, but it had its own gods and pantheon and culture. But it wasn't on Mars, so there's going to be some overlap.
Correct, exactly. So a third chapter in this chapter in the session is, in the words of Plato, what did Plato say?
What did he say?
What did he say? Well, the demise of Atlantis resulted from destructive natural forces. Okay? And that could be earthquakes, tidal waves, all that sort of stuff. And then we also get this from Donovan,
Sure.
his song Atlantis.
Right.
The concept of Atlantis was an island which lay before the Great Flood, which actually might be the good final tune for this episode.
I've used it so many times. Why not? It's actually saved in my computer. I've used it so many times.
Got it. Yeah. So, and this goes back to a word that you used at the opening of our session today, Santorini and the Thera eruption. Thera was the name of the volcanic eruption. Now, 1600 BCE. So we're in that realm of Gnosis. The Palace of Gnosis was 1900 BCE. Massive, massive, massive volcanic eruption. And the ash and other things that could fly through the air went to the east, and they went to the south. And when they went to the south, they hit Crete. And after the eruption, people of Crete picked up that ash and used it for various types of things. So they utilized the ash, and that's why we know we have piles of ash. We have so on. Now, there was also tsunamis, and I said tsunamis that generated from the eruption. And this is not, first there was like an original tsunami, the first tsunami, which hit parts of Crete that could be monitored at 30 feet tall. But the tsunamis bounced back and forth between the islands. And so, the 30 foot could hit a village town, everybody runs down to help out, and then another one hits.
Right.
Now, as we saw earlier in the program, that the Minoans were seafaring people. We had boats at Santorini, and so there, as coastal peoples, they lost a lot. Like I said, they lost everything, but they lost a lot, at least on the north side of the island. So yeah, massive tsunami, 30 feet tall, which isn't that, in today's world, isn't that big unless you live in Miami. Miami, everything gets washed out. Here in Oregon, it's really not a big deal because we have a mountain range between the coast and the city.
Show off.
Yeah. But Baltimore, you guys would be, you'd be underwater.
No, we'd be dead. Yeah.
You'd be dead. But I would come to rescue you.
Uh-huh.
The podcast.
That's great.
Now, so let's look at the Thera eruption at Santorini in respect to the Minoan Palace of Gnosis. The Thera eruption was 1600 BCE, reliably dated many different ways. And the end of the Palace of Gnosis was 1350 BCE. Therefore, the Minoans at Knossos lived on for 250 years past the Thera eruption. So the end of Minoans was not a result of the Thera eruption and tsunami.
Couldn't have made things easy, but they lived. They persevered.
They lived on. And some of the most beautiful pottery of the period, of the Minoans, one should say, came after the Thera eruption and tsunami.
Yeah, I know that nobody can see it, but that flask with the octopus, that is some ornate work.
That came 100 to 150 years after the Thera eruption tsunami.
Well, nothing inspires people like a brush with probably for like divine death.
So people lived on. Therefore, Plato's narrative. Crete could not have been the narrative, the place for Plato's Atlantis, because they lived on. They weren't completely destroyed, and that's the story. Now, let's go back to Santorini, and there is the Hotel Atlantis in Santorini. The people in Santorini and the people in Crete, they own this narrative of Atlantis, okay? It's part of their story, it's part of their marketing. And there's lots of earthquakes still going on in the region. It's a known, okay, the thing. Now, there are many other Atlantis tellings, and we've encountered them in our lifetime. The man from Atlantis, it was in my age group growing up.
Sure,
Duffy.
Right. Web fingers. Mm-hmm.
Aquaman was Atlantis.
Sure.
Blue Mermaid lives in Atlantica, so it's Atlantis. There's Stargate Atlantis, and then there's Disney Atlantis, among the many others that are out there. There's many, many, many out there. Okay. Now, in Players Timaeus, he wrote that around him were 100 Nereids, and they're riding on dolphins. And it's an image that everybody's seen. It's the dolphins on this this fresco panel. It's absolutely beautiful. And people point and say, well, that's Atlantis. These people, these the Nereids riding on the dolphins, these sea nymphs. That is what people say. Except when you look a little closer at that panel, which is absolutely beautiful, nothing's riding on the dolphins.
Yeah.
Not Nereids.
I mean, listen, I might miss one sea nymph, but I'm not missing sea nymphs riding on all those dolphins, and there's not a single one. Unless I don't understand what a sea nymph looks like, those dolphins look to be free of any burdens.
Exactly. But this is one of the images that they call out, archaeologists and others call out and say, well, that's Atlantis. They're not riding on the dolphins.
Plot loophole right there.
Now, in Plato's Timaeus and Critias, the knowledge among the Atlanteans, there's no electronics, no submarines, no stargates, and the like. But they did have art, according to Plato. They had geometry for construction, astronomy for ocean navigation, law, government, stone, architecture, and animal husbandry. And I read this because I read both books, and I kind of researched this topic as I sometimes do. Now, the Atlantic case for Crete and Santorini, which comes from archaeologists and other people out there, is that there's pre-Greek archaeological evidence and cultural traditions possibly believed by Plato to be Atlantis, meaning that Plato saw these ruins and said, well, maybe that's Atlantis. And we'll go through these. The dates are reasonably similar, they say. That's what they say. The locations are geographically close. That's what they say. And Crete and also Santorini are named in Plato's works on Atlantis. We would test that hypothesis. And there was an actual Atlantis as Plato described. Now, another one of these images we see is one of those famous concepts of images.
The bull dancers. I know what that is.
It's the bull. It's the bull. And according to Plato, they hunted bulls without weapons. And the image of these people doing acrobatics over the bulls kind of looks like that. I'll buy it. Leaping bull fresco at Knossos.
Mm-hmm. It
doesn't make the case, but they hunted bulls without weapons, and that is one of the evidences. We can find this in many other artifacts in the Ashmolean Museum in the UK. There's a gold ring of a male leaping over a bull. So the fresco's not a one-off.
And also, not to make Plato seem trite, but with the exception of the hunting bulls without weapons, the other traits that he attributed to Atlantis just seem to be basic traits that archaeologists and anthropologists attribute to what we call civilization now, sort of basic hallmarks of when something is a pre-civilization versus a civilization, which may or may not be show a bias against hunter-gatherers and pastoral lifestyles, but he might have been the first modern archaeologist, anthropologist accidentally.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And this is what I would say, is that Plato looked at the Palace of Minos, and he said, or heard the Palace of Minos, and he said, these are very old rooms, very old. And he also looked at the Great Pyramid of Egypt, or heard about the Great Pyramid of Egypt. He was there, he would have been. And which is also very old. The difference between the Great Pyramid of Egypt and the Palace of Knossos is we know he knew who made the Great Pyramid of Egypt, Giza, whereas he didn't know who made the Palace of Minos. But he would have looked at the Palace of Minos and said, these are very old and they're collapsed by natural forces. And I think that makes it's an interesting case to say, well, these the pyramids are still there. The people say they made them. There's some of the same script. Where's the Palace of Minos? Nobody knows who did it. They're a vanished people. Okay. So let's put this in the timeline of Plato versus the Palace of Minos. Plato was 348 BCE.
Do we know when? I'm sorry to interrupt, but do we know when the people on Crete lost the ability to understand the language of Crete, the written language of Crete? Because it's probably in there somewhere. I mean, maybe it happened with all these tsunamis that the literate class were the ones who died. Maybe they lived, like now they lived on the sea. They had the good real estate, and maybe the inland people who weren't allowed to read or didn't need to read or whatever never. They're the ones who survived. I don't know.
So part answer to the question is one can date the Minoan script, and when it first becomes apparent and when we no longer find artifacts. And then, so the answer to that is yes. I don't know the dates, but no one could read it. So they're this great mystery.
It's as good an amateurish impromptu theory as any, but there's absolutely no research behind my theory. There might be people who have researched that or are researching it. I'm just not aware of it.
Exactly. So Plato was 1,000 years or so after the end of the Palace of Gnosis. And so he really didn't know. He was getting from other sources. But what Plato did write in his Critias is that 9,000 years before Solon, actually 9,000 years before Solon, was the island of Atlantis now sunk by earthquakes. So he gives us 9,000 years before Solon. Solon was 2,630 years before the present. Therefore, Atlantis would be 12,630 years ago, according to Plato. Okay, 12,630 years.
Yeah.
And you hear this dating an awful lot because that they say, well, Göbekli Tepe is a similar timeline. The Younger Dryas was a similar timeline. Therefore, they must be connected to Plato's Atlantis. But there's a big problem with that timing. Is that Plato just used big numbers, big round numbers, to do everything he didn't know, to count anything he didn't know the dating of. He said that the Egyptian works are molded in the same form as they were 10,000 years ago. So he throws out another date, 10,000 years ago. Okay. Did Plato estimate ancient Egypt 11,572 years before our present time? Of course not. But he just threw out these big numbers. And we still use this today, so we shouldn't laugh at Plato. The Peter, Paul, and Mary, 500 miles. If you miss the train I'm on, Lord, I'm 1, Lord, I'm 2, Lord, I'm 4, 500 miles from my home. And that's really the...
Maybe that'll be the outro for this song. I'm sure I've never used that before.
It's a good one. Right. And it's speaking of time as in big metaphorical numbers.
Listen, Plato's not the only one to do it.
More than 9,000.
To be frank, in fairness to Plato, he was a little bit modest. I mean, the Egyptian list of kings goes back like 300 and something thousand years, and the Babylonian Sumerian one goes back over 400,000 years, and this is all absurd. So he was actually rather modest. I mean, by the time he got to the Bible, I mean, while there were some people who lived to be 900 and something years old, I mean, like 40 years was sort of the placeholder for a long time.
You may have had people in your podcast in the past, or I'm sure another podcast, that give us exact dating to the end of Atlantis based on Plato's numbers.
Yes. I mean, I wouldn't say more exact than this, but yeah, I mean, I've heard this time frame many a time.
But the 9,000 years before Solon is complete nonsense.
The funny thing is, I keep hearing different...
Big, large numbers that say it was just that so far long ago, in the same way as Peter, Paul, and Mary, 500 miles from home, and the many other songs of that nature that have been come along.
Yeah, the thing I hear the most variance of is how much distance there is between Plato and his ancestor Solon. I've heard anything from it's like his great uncle to 600 years between them.
And either way, but he says, gives us 9,000 for the Atlantis, gives us 10,000 for the Egyptians.
Right.
So he's
at that point, what's the difference? If once you're
it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
He's using these big metaphorical numbers, and that's really important. So Plato's location of Atlantis. So he said it was lay over against the pillars of Heracles, in extent greater than Libya and Asia put together. That comes is Timaeus. The great island lay over against the pillars of Heracles, and the pillars of Heracles, of course, is the span between the Strait of Gibraltar and Jebel Musa or Morocco on the other side. And so Plato gives us a place. And the place is nowhere near Crete, Santorini, or even Athens.
Right. I have heard other people try to propose that there's different pillars of Hercules out there at the time, but they too are in the wrong direction, maybe sometimes in the other wrong direction, but they too are not Santorini or Crete or Sicily or anything like that either. They're like closer to the Dardanelles or whatever. So either way, but yeah, I have always heard that it was between Gibraltar and Morocco. I can't pronounce that word, but at the tip of Morocco as well. Sort of where Force 10 from Navarone.
Jabalusa.
Is that where Force 10 from Navarone had to go in the old movie?
Yeah, that was yes. That was
the Guns of Navarone and then Force 10 from Navarone. I remember. I had the toys. I had a little mountain set. I built a cannon and all of that.
So, Platus Timaeus, he wrote that Atlantis reached in Europe to Terravania, which is non-Greek, and in Libya to Egypt. So he also says that Atlantis doesn't go to Egypt. So there can't be an Atlantis-Egypt connection to Crete.
Makes sense.
They're not connected. It's completely different entities. So the people that try to make this love triangle, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. So people always look at Plato and say, well, he's the source of Atlantis and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is that Plato is not the earliest source of Atlantis. In Herodotus, in his histories, he wrote that the mountain Atlas was called the Pillar of Heaven by the natives, the Atlantes. So lofty, moreover, that the top, it is said, cannot be seen, the clouds never quitting it either summer or winter. Herodotus wrote of Atlantis, calling them the Atlantes at a very high mountain. And we actually know that mountain. It is the highest mountain in North Africa, which is Jebel Tobakal, Mount Atlas. You know, that's what in Arabic it's Jebel Tobakal, but in Greek it's translated Mount Atlas. Now, it is also the same place where Atlas holds up the sky in the Far East Atlas. It was part of Atlas mythology. And that all comes about by Perseus. He has the image of Medusa that he flashes onto the Titan Atlas, who then turns into stone. Perseus became before Hercules. Hercules arrives. He's negotiating with a being that is in fact stone. It's the same mountain. Jebel Tobakal is Mount Atlas, which is where the mountain of Herodotus is so lofty. That is the highest mountain in North Africa, which is Jebel Tobakal.
Well, who was holding up the world before all this happened?
We need to have a session on that, like a total, complete session. He's not holding up the world, he's holding up the sky. The highest mountain would be holding up the sky because there's nothing above the mountain but the sky.
Okay. Well, who was holding up the sky before he turned to stone? As ELO would say, turn to stone.
I think that's sort of a mythological question.
Oh.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, maybe it's possible all of this is mythological and allegorical?
I would say that Jebel Tobakal is Mount Atlas, which is the mountain that Herodotus is talking about, which is the same area of the woods that Plato says his Atlantis is. Now, let's put this in a timeline. Okay, Herodotus came just before Plato.
Yeah, but just before is 77 years. I mean that
exactly.
That's
he had no direct information about the Minoan Palace of Gnosis.
Right.
Okay? So there's no, he knew nothing about that. But his source was in fact his source was the Greek mythology. Before Herodotus, there was Sanchinato. Sanchinato wrote, Atlas was the brother of Time, who had traveled to the western part of Africa, where he settled on a high mountain that supported the heavens. And that's your question. So as to devote himself to the study of astronomy. Sanchinato was 1200 BCE.
Well, it wasn't brother of Time, he was the brother of Kronos.
Okay, that would make sense. I did not know that.
Yeah, they're both Titans.
So the narrative of western part of Africa, the highest mountain, is holding up the sky. It didn't start with Herodotus. Sure, it didn't start with Plato. This was an established place.
I did not know that Atlas, however, was an astronomer, that he was a scientist. I just thought he was a big lug that even Hercules, who's a pretty big lug, tricked him at one point during one of the labors of Hercules.
And that absolutely becomes a later or closer to our time story. Now, Sanchinato was 1200 BCE. He would have known He knew about the Minoan Palace of Knossos, and he knew about the end at that time, 150 years. He would have known about the fall of the Minoans. He would not have combined or flagelated the Minoans with Western North Africa, Atlantis.
Right.
He would not have mixed those up. I will buy that Herodotus could mix it up, but he didn't. I would buy that Plato could have mixed it up, but he didn't. But Sanchinato did mix up the two, because he was close enough in time that he knew of the end of the Minoans.
I'm sorry, where is Sanchinato from?
He was Phoenician.
Oh,
Based on your earlier description, he was a raider, he was a Viking, he was a plunderer, a marauder.
So he was a gentleman pirate?
Actually, my understanding is the Phoenicians actually come out with their Semitic peoples.
So what was his home base? Like, was it Byblos? Would that make sense since he writes books?
So they were Semitic peoples.
Okay.
Call it Palestine. Okay.
No. I'm Jewish. We call it Israel. We call it Israel. We still use Israel.
The region. But anyway, that's Sanchinato would have known that the Minoan Palace of Knossos and the Minoans were not Atlantis.
We don't use the colonizer language of the Romans and the British.
Yeah, he would have known. So, Plato's location of Atlantis, the Pillar of Hercules, does not match with Crete or Santorini. Just doesn't match in any possible way. There's no narrative. People can make that up. It's just not a thing. So how about these names historically associated with Crete? And I went through, I have the Kindle version, and I have hard copy. And I typed in all the names that people use for Crete. Crete, Cretanas, which is the Latin, the Knossos, Homer, Crus, and I go through the whole list of absolutely known. And none of them show up in Timaeus and Critias. But Crete or Cretanas do show up in multiple works by Plato. So Plato doesn't use those words in his Timaeus and Critias. Doesn't use it. And so the archaeologists and other people who pro-Crete Atlantean archaeologists who should go back and read the book.
Listen, if you can narrow down where Sanchinato is from, I mean, I'll call him Anatolian. I'm happy to call him Assyrian, or Lebanese, Egyptian, whatever it is. But we don't use the P word.
Exactly. And so the names associated. What about Santorini? Same. Running through my Kindle. The answer is Santorini, Thera, Calliste, and others. They're not in Timaeus. It's in Timaeus or Cretias.
All right.
Plato doesn't use them. So the people should go back and read the books.
No one's going back and reading the books that's listening to a podcast. Come on.
Well, the people are making this Crete-Atlantis argument. So the case for Atlantis and Crete Santorini, they were pre-Greek archaeological evidence and cultural traditions possibly believed by Plato to be Atlantis. I'll buy that story.
I think the people who are making these Crete or Santorini Atlantis arguments are the tourism boards of Crete and Santorini, and I don't think they're about to change their ways. Just like every island in the Caribbean is where Columbus first landed.
Exactly, and of course there's a Hotel Atlantis, the hotel bookshop in Santorini. So the dates are reasonably simple. I don't know, because he just gave these huge big numbers. The locations are geographically close to. Absolutely not.
Not really.
Wrong side of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Crete and Santorini are named in Plato's works. Not in his Timaeus and Critias, that's for sure. There was an actual Atlantis, as Plato described. Not really, but it's hard to say. So going back to this, we had this PBS thinking of Atlantis, where we started, the fall of Minoans back in 2011. Plato wrote about Atlantis. Archaeologists have begun to believe the legend may have started on Crete. Yeah, he knew about runes. Yeah, he knew there were people there that didn't know where they came from, their roots. But it wasn't Crete. Atlantis wasn't Crete or Santorini. There's no evidence of the piles of ways that we can look at it scientifically, mythologically. None of it adds up. Not one of it.
Right.
So we can.
So it's like the folks who tell me that King Arthur is a different version of the telling of the story of Jesus. And let's just assume it's true. That doesn't mean that it took place in the Holy Land. It took place in Britain.
Exactly. That is exactly the case. And so that's my pitch on the whole thing. I read it, I hear about it, I hear these crazy dates, and we've gone to sort of the root of these stories and say, well, in fact, they none of these things add up. And it's a general narrative of Atlantis existed before Plato, Herodotus, who was just near to his time, and Sanchinato, who was much earlier than his time.
I'd never heard of Sanchinato before, so in addition to the other new things I learned something that's completely new and really, really cool. Yeah, that's great. I never thought that Crete was Atlantis. I mean, this is a shocker. I don't think there was an Atlantis. I think it's a allegory. That's fine. I think if anyone actually, read the Plato story of it, I mean, they probably wouldn't look to it as being, the root culture anyway, because they didn't really fare so hot in the story. It's not like, so anyway, but yeah, I was not convinced by the Santorini thing either. But you heard it before. You've heard it. Yes, I have. From people on this very show. And listen, I respect anyone's opinion, and I think those are all interesting. But I mean, volcanoes erupting in the Mediterranean, newsflash, that's not the only volcano that erupted in the Mediterranean. A place called Pompeii, Mount Etna. There's there's a whole bunch of others. I mean, the world's full of volcanoes, and we know that. And because one day Ghana is going to come out of them, and Godzilla and Mothra and all of the monsters. I just hope that before AI turns Skynet upon us, that it does figure out how to translate some of these languages, so we get some information, and then they can turn on Skynet and the robots can take over. Because it's inevitable anyway. So, but that's a sunny note, right? Absolutely. Another day, another time, and another day. But yeah, this was fun. We got to, because you've been popping the Atlantis question in for all these episodes we had. So we've said what it is not. Right. We've said where it possibly could be, but there's more to the story that we can cover on another day. Well, that's fun, because I actually sort of tricked you, because I was more interested in the Crete and Minoan aspects of it and sort of that, and we got that, which was great. Than the Atlantis, but I have to go with what the guest is passionate as the lead to and hope that it gets me where I want, which sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So it's almost like as if Atlantis was the cover to tell a story about Crete, to the audience who doesn't care anything about Crete would like to hear about Atlantis. Is that about right? That's probably the actual truth of what's going to happen out there, is that everyone's going to be like, cool, Atlantis, Crete, shut up, Jeff. So everyone wins or everybody loses equally. But Bernie, thank you once again. Please tell everyone where you are, where to find you, where to support you, and all that other good stuff. I see a whole bunch of things here, but so there's www.beforeorion.com. But everywhere. Before Orion is my place, is my handle, right? CB Buddy, and YouTube. But the source is beforeorion.com, and that'll link you all around the internet for lots and lots of videos and all kinds of interesting stuff. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to subscribe to anything except like and subscribe to Jeff's Garden of Thought. Yeah, that'd be wonderful if you did that. And also, I'm on YouTube also. Now, there's no pictures there yet. There may be one day. There can be. I just have to change the technology. But that depends on there being enough subscribers. People are watching, or at least listening, on YouTube. I'm actually surprised. I figured that nobody would. And sometimes sometimes it's 3, but sometimes it's 33 or 60. Wow, and I'm like, great. Yeah, and there's nothing but the show art there, and just our voices. And YouTube is slightly harder to adjust the speed rate upon which you listen. So I'm very impressed by the people are doing it, and so yeah. Anyway, it's at the @ symbol Garden of Thought Pod, all one word. So if you could subscribe there, that's great. And yeah, I don't know if we get enough subscribers on there, that will incentivize me to drop Zoom and pick up StreamYard, which has a built-in interface with lots of places, including YouTube, and thus I will do that because I mean, we use Zoom. I mean, I see the guests most of the time, and they see me. And most of us, bathe and comb our hair, or don't care about combing our hair. I mean, I have plenty of guests that like wild hair is their thing, and that's cool and that's fun to see. Plus, I've got the show with the pro wrestlers, and pro wrestlers are usually interesting looking people, and so that's fun too. So yeah, so if you're here because you're a fan of Bernie and Before Orion and you haven't been here before, or you're here by accident, welcome. It's Garden of Thought. You'll generally get 2 or 3 shows a week, probably more like 2 most of the time. A lot are like this. Some are a little bit more fantastical. Some are far less fantastical. Some are even legal, if you can believe it or not. Then there's ones with the pro wrestlers, which some of them are like this, and others are nonsense. And why do people fight at Waffle House? And what's the best cheesesteak in Philly? And whatever happened to FUBU? And it's just all sorts of really important things that the folks are interested in and need to know. And occasionally we get some insight and break some news in the wrestling world, in case you're interested in that, because that's not really the purpose of the show, but it happens anyway. Anyway. Thanks again to Bernie. What's the name of that Peter Palmieri song again? Is it just called 500 Miles?
I believe it's 500 Miles.
All right. Well, I think that's what we're going to use. Not that I don't love Donovan Atlantis. I love him maybe a little bit too much. But if I keep using it, I mean, I think his estate probably should come after me because it's going to become an actual theme of the show. Anyway, thanks to Bernie. I'm sure we'll hear from him again in a few months when we figure out what our next visit will be or what his next project is. And to the rest of you, please subscribe, and you'll hear from us later in the week.
Miss the train I'm on, you will know that I am gone. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles, 100 miles, 100 miles, 100 miles, 100 miles. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. Lord, I'm 1, Lord, I'm 2. Lord, I'm 3, Lord, I'm 4, Lord, I'm 500 miles from my home. 500 miles, 500 miles, 500 miles, 500 miles. Lord, I'm 500 miles from my home. Not a shirt on my back, not a penny to my name. Lord, I can't go home this away, this away, this away, this away, this away. Lord, I can't go home this away. If you miss the train I'm on, you will know that I am gone. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles.